Good evening and welcome to this policy exchange event on bridging the educational divide. We have an extremely distinguished speaker for you this evening. Paul Collier is literally one of the world's leading development economists. He's a professor in development and globalisation at Oxford. He's the author of a number of absolutely best-selling books, including Plundered Planets and Bottom Billion. But actually this evening we're going to be talking about something really quite different, which is at the start of the year, my attention was drawn to an extremely interesting article Paul wrote in The Independent, which caused, I think it's fair to say, quite a furore at the time, because it raised a whole series of really provocative, in the best sense of the word, provocative questions about what we think it is that we're trying to do with our education system and the fundamental principles behind it. So Paul is going to enlarge on some of the themes in that article this evening, I hope, and he's going to speak for a while, and we're going to have some open discussion. So without any further ado, Paul, it's a total pleasure to have you at Policy Exchange. When I was at university, by the way, we used to have a rule that said, if people have written a good book, they can't lecture, and if people lecture well, they probably, their books are probably terrible. Paul is a total exception to that rule, writing both brilliant books and also being a great speaker, so it's great. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for coming. I'm an economist at Oxford, and I work on developing countries. So, on developing countries, I've been active in the policy arena for years, and I've learned how to shift policy. I've learned an idea which I launched, which sounds totally wacky. Once people have forgotten where it came from, within 5 to 10 years, it quite often becomes the orthodoxy, right? But initially, the reaction to new ideas is that they're wacky. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to speak tonight. My credentials for speaking about education are altogether threadbare. They're massively different from my credentials for speaking about the things I usually speak about. So let me set out what those credentials are. And they're entirely personal. I don't usually speak about myself, but in the present context, actually appropriate. I think it's very. You might have come across Alan Bennett's The History Boys, and I'm a history boy. I'm even more of a history boy than Alan Bennett, because if you remember, Alan Bennett's great play is not set in Leeds, where Alan Bennett came from. It's set in a school in Sheffield, because that produced a wonderful line by one of the history boys who sums up his nightmare situation. I'm short, I'm gay, and I'm from Sheffield. I'm from Sheffield. I'm from that school, and other than that, I'm pretty well Alan Bennett. So, like him, my father was a butcher. He left school at 12, and my mum was a shop assistant, and she left school at 12. And here I am, professor at Oxford, Harvard, and the sort of right? So, a world of change. Thanks to the 1947 Education Act, which for me made the difference between carrying on like my dad. When I was age 4, I was still on a box with my dad and my granddad making pork sausages. So my fate beckoned quite clearly, and it wasn't to Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. So that's my personal experience of the transformation that education can lead on a life, transform my life. And then much more recently, the rest of my family hasn't done as well as I have, and so a year ago I had to adopt my distant relatives with children who were then aged 1 and 2. We got them out of the clutches of Birmingham social services, being in foster care. You may remember the headlines on the Birmingham social services. They're not the best. By the time we got the kids out of them, And so, combined with my own little boy who was dyslexic, I've seen the wonders that the state can do in education, and I've seen right up front, day by day, very urgent needs. So those are my credentials for education, which are not very much. But what I did as a parent, thinking about what choices I faced and what needs these kids had, I tried to apply what I usually do, which is what I've got is analytic economics and a lot of experience of public policy around the world, especially in poor countries. So I tried to apply that to education, and it's very much going back to first principles. And I don't know, as will become brutally apparent, I don't know the details of the British education system as well as you do, other than as a consumer through my children. There are two key policy dimensions in education. One is the mode of organisation for the delivery of education. State, NGO, private. And the other dimension is funding. Who pays? So one dimension, what sort of organisations deliver. The other dimension, who pays. And they're completely analytically distinct. So usually in debates they're all muddled up, but they're completely distinct. Let me start with mostly what I've got to say is about that second dimension of who pays, the finance. But let me start with that dimension of who should organise delivery. The subject I deal with, which is poverty, has a big dose of ideology in it, on both sides. But that is as of nothing to education. Education, British education debate seems to have been dominated by ideological thinking on both sides as far as I should, as an aside, say, you find it very, if you read my stuff, you'll find it very hard to pigeonhole me politically. If you manage to, please tell me. So let's start with that dimension of the organisation. Who should organise schools? Now there's a lot of ideology on both sides. Should be the state should do it all versus the superiority of private, non-government provision. From my reading of the evidence, which is global and economic, basically, we don't know very much. There's not a lot of clear-cut results here. Each side seizes on some particular item of evidence, but it's not a very clear-cut pattern of evidence. If you think about it from first principles, there's one clear principle, and that is that the state's comparative advantage is in delivering things that are simple but have to be delivered on big scale, because then the state can do standard provision at lower unit cost than other organisations. So what you'd expect is, as complexity increases, so you need more differentiated provision. If we look at the three levels, I'm going to just distinguish three levels of education: the under fives, the school age, and the tertiary. And so that would suggest that the under fives, there's not much complexity in delivering for the under fives. With the under fives, you're not actually trying to teach them very much, you're trying to socialise them. So the amount of learning they're supposed to do is basically social learning. So at that level, low levels of organisational complexity. If you go to the other end, tertiary, high levels of complexity, students very differentiated by them. And then in between, school is just in between. So what you'd expect would be to have state provision at the bottom, non-state provision at the tertiary, and heaven knows in the middle. Heaven knows literally being we don't know, and therefore in situations where we don't know, you want a mixture and you want experiment and evaluation. What we see is not that. At the under fives level, what we see is the state largely absent. So the majority of under fives education is non-state provision. Some of it not for profit, some of it for profit. The result of that, I think, is high unit costs. In fact, it's one stage worse than that. It's actually rationed provision. If you've got little kids, you'll find it's actually very difficult to find places. It doesn't have to be like that. When my 9-year-old was aged 2.5 to 5, we happened to be living in France. And there they run a completely different system. It's called the école maternelle, which is just a state-run system provisioned between the ages of 2.5 and 5, state-run and financed by taxation. And there's one huge advantage of that, apart from, I think, very low unit costs, is that therefore everybody goes. Everybody sends their children. It's just normal. I'll come back to that in a moment when I turn to finance. But that seems to be the obvious way to run the under fives. And it's particularly important for the most marginalised children in society, because one thing we do, I think, now know with some confidence is that the earlier they get into the education system, the better. And so 2.5, get them into a standardised school where the children of the dysfunctional families go because everybody goes. At the other end of the hierarchy of educational organisations, the tertiary, I think Britain's actually more or less got it right, which is Britain's education, tertiary education, is run by NGOs. And they're called universities, but effectively they're NGOs. The amount of state involvement in the organisation is pretty minimal. If you compare, again, across the channel with France, France is doing the right thing at the preschool level, mass state provision. And it's using exactly the same system at the tertiary level, mass state provision. And école maternelle in France is widely recognised as a brilliant system. And just as the French university system is widely recognised as a disaster. I'm a professor in it, I've seen it for 20 years. So it's not that one system dominates another, state provision dominates private provision, or the other way around. It's that as complexity rises, the state, the advantages of the state, which are scale, therefore cheapness, are outweighed by the disadvantages of the state. It can't handle complexity and differentiation. So I don't think either Britain or France have got their education system right, but Britain really, I think, should be borrowing from France that standardised mass provision of preschool, and the children that would benefit most are the most marginalised. And what that preschool teaches them is essentially socialisation. Let's turn from the organisation, form of organisation, to the, I think, much more important issue of finance. Most of the debate and the energy in British education debates, it revolves around who should deliver. It's the mode of organisation, state or non-state. But I think most of the important issues are about finance. And to I've got to make a move which will completely abstract from the mode of organisation debate, whether it should be state or private. And I've got to assume that quality of education is entirely linear in how much you spend per child. Sorry, that's a fancy economic way of saying, we're just going to say, assume that the more you spend, the better the quality, and it doesn't matter what sort of organisation delivers. We can revisit that assumption, but we've got to maintain that assumption just to get rid of all the confusions surrounding should it be public, should it be private. So linear, quality of education, linear instead. And then who's going to pay? Essentially the choice is to what extent should the government be paying, to what extent should households be paying. That's basically the issue. And again, we've got these three different levels: the under fives, the school age, and the tertiary. Now if you look at what happens in Britain, the under fives, what we've got is blended funding. So you get some money from the state, and you use some money from your own household to put your under five into some sort of preschool. That's the norm. The channels for financing the under fives are really pretty complex. Both my wife and I have doctorates from Oxford, and we decided we needed them to actually fathom out. We seem to have got three different government channels of funding for our 3-year-old and our 4-year-old. But in combination, it's of course nowhere near enough to pay for their preschool, so it's a blend of that state money from these three different sources and our own money. The state provision of money is not only complex, so a lot of people must miss it, it's also really quite bizarre criteria. Like if you take the child vouchers scheme, which we benefit from, the higher your income, the more it's worth, but it's unrelated even to the most basic feature of need, like how many children have you got. So I defy anybody to sit down and design a rational public funding scheme for the under fives, which would look like what we've got. It just, if we just abstract from the politics, this is clearly an accumulation of sort of random decisions that will never be reconciled, in my view. So that's the under fives. We've got this funny combination of predominantly private provision of the organisation and blended funding, with most of the blend coming from households rather than from the state. Then if we go to tertiary level, we've also got blended funding, but with the opposite balance. Most of the money comes from the state, and a smaller amount comes from households. And we can presume with the fiscal crisis that a larger proportion is going to come from households. But again, it seems kind of a preposterous design that at the under fives, most of the money is coming from households, whereas at the 18s, it's coming mostly from the state. Because apart from anything else, the sheer regressive nature of this is just manifest. So again, if you sat down and tried to design a system of combining, saying who should pay for this level of education, you'd never come up with what you've got. But the real damage, and this is the heart of my talk, is the middle tier. So we've got blended funding at the preschool, with the bias towards the private household. We've got blended funding at the tertiary, with the bias towards the state. And then in the middle, we've got a ban on blended funding. Private schools are permitted, state schools are permitted, but blended funding is banned. And we've got quite a big private sector, of course. It's much more important than the raw numbers, because as you move up to look at who rises up to the tertiary level, especially who rises up to Oxbridge, then the products of the private education system become very important. By the time you get to Oxbridge, it's kind of 50%. So what does that ban on blended funding at the school level, what are its consequences? We can see why it's happened. It's a political compromise between an ideological left that would like to see private not exist, but knows it can't do that, and so just doesn't want any money to go there, and a hard right which doesn't really care what happens to the people who can't afford the state, as long as there's good private provision. So we can see politically why this has happened over the years, but let's look at its consequences rather than politics. And there are three really dysfunctional consequences. One is that the quality of education, as measured by the spend per child, is bimodal. If you just drew a frequency distribution of expenditure on children's education in school, it would be bimodal, if you understand what bimodal is. There's one big hump around £5,000 per child in the state sector, and there's another big hump around about £15,000 per child in the private sector, and practically nothing in between. Now, that is inevitable given the ban on state funding. Because imagine, why is there no market for, let's say, a £6,000 quality of education? Because to get a £6,000 quality of education costs you £6,000 more than a £5,000 education, but you only get 1,000 extra. So you'd have to be dumb to want to buy that. Because you'd have to be dumb to want to buy that, there aren't enough dumb people, and so there's no market in selling it. And so there's a missing middle. Now, of course, the language of the left is equity. Equity, and of course, everybody's the same if they're in the state sector, and the language of the right is freedom. But actually, we've got neither equity nor freedom. We've got a bimodal distribution. Now, I work all the time on distribution issues. That's half the subject of poverty in poor countries. What's the distribution? I've never come across any significant dimension of the quality of well-being which is as unequal as a bimodal distribution. All distributions are a normal or log, that is the hump in the middle. And so our policy of the ban on permitting private education with banning blended funding has produced this extraordinary inequality of the bimodal distribution. And you're all used to this, you live it with it. If you came at it just from looking at distributions of inequality without knowing what this was, you'd think you'd hit something that was totally off the map of being. So that's one consequence, bimodality. And bimodality, as I believe, just scarred this society for decades. It's produced a sort of educational apartheid with ramifications through our class system and so on. Second consequence of is even more damaging than the bimodality. And that is that the quality of education acquired by the average person, the average family, is lower than they would choose. How come? Because the average family would probably want to spend something on their child's education. They probably want to supplement the provision of the state. Not all families. Some couldn't afford it, and some will choose not to. But the norm is that people care about their kids, struggle for them, and would like to put some money in. Nor is it impossible for them to put money in, because the state provides households who have children with a big subsidy. The average household, I don't mean the people paying the 40% tax rate, the average household is receiving something around £3,000 per child as a subsidy for that child. And that money received by the household can be spent on anything the parents like, anything they choose. Drink, cigarettes, anything, as long as it's not their children's education. The only people who can spend their money on their children's education are the people who are in a high enough income bracket that they can afford private education. So then they can afford, they're in a position to be able to put this money that the state's providing them into education. But for the ordinary household, you can spend it on anything except your child's education. Suppose we lifted that restriction, and suppose that the average household cared enough about their children to spend half the money that they get for their children on their children. So that they get £3,000 and they'd spend £1,500. Doesn't seem to me an unlikely sort of number. Then what would that do to the average spend per child on education? It would push it up from £5,000 per child to £6,500. In other words, you'd get a 30% increase in the spend per child. Now, just at the moment, in the present budgetary horizon, that's the only way I can think we're going to get an increase in expenditure per child for the average, just for the ordinary child. It gets one stage worse than that, because of course the average family does care about their children and does spend money on their children's education. But the way they do it, because they're not allowed to spend their money on the child's schooling directly, the only way they've got to spend their money on their child's education is through the housing market. And so we do get that £1,500 spent on education, but it's to try and buy a house in a good catchment area. Now the difference, one fundamental difference between spending your money that way on your children's education and spending it actually by paying it to the school. And that is that spending it through the housing market is what economists call a zero-sum game. That is, all it does is push some people up and others down, but leaves the quality of education completely unaffected. And so all the vast money that households are spending on improving their child's education has no effect on the average quality of education whatsoever. It just pushes the bottom further down. Which is why at the bottom things are really brilliant. So we've got a ban which has these three disastrous effects. Extreme bifurcation, the bimodal distribution. The average household not allowed to pushed into having a lower quality education, a £5,000 quality education, when it could probably choose something more like a £6,500 education. Just to the side, we have the opposite effect at the very top, where rich households are forced to buy more education than they would like, because their choice is either, it makes no sense to buy a sort of £7,000 education. You get an extra 2,000 quality, and it costs you 7,000. And so if you're high income, you're lured into spending more than you would choose in China. Whereas the average household is forced into the opposite, to spend less. So lifting the ban, you get a convergence onto a normal distribution, the hump in the middle. So bimodality, lower average quality for the average person, and diversion into the housing market, and this zero-sum game, which pushes the bottom down. I've got to draw to a close in a minute, but just let me some final remarks. What about the kids at the bottom? What about the kids at the bottom? Because their parents, either due to lack of means or lack of will, are not going to be prepared to spend any money on their children. So, what about them? It seems to be at present we're sort of imprisoned by that concern to say, well, everybody except the higher income groups has got to put up with the same spend that the neglectful, the negligent parents and the impoverished parents would spend, namely zero. Because you've got a minority of parents that couldn't or wouldn't spend. Everybody who isn't rich has got to do the same. And we do that in the name of equity. It isn't very equitable, but it does drag the average down. But what can we do to rectify? There's 2 points. One is by lifting the zero-sum game of the housing market, you directly pull the bottom. The bottom wouldn't be pushed down as much through the housing system. But secondly, we could do targeted supplementary funding, the way that the Liberals were suggesting in the last election campaign. You can target supplementary funding at households with objective characteristics that look most needy. I see no problem with doing that. So, that's where I'm going to pretty well close. What I've said about funding is orthogonal to organisation. You can have blended funding with any form of delivery of schooling. It could, in principle, all be state, it could all be private, it doesn't matter. The funding, blended funding, can sit across any structure of organisation. I think the case for blended funding seems to be pretty strong. With the case of differentiated organisation, I go back and say all we really know, I think, is that the more complexity in delivery, the more we need non-government. And in the great tranche of schooling in the middle, we don't know the answers, and therefore we should have diversity and experiment. And hopefully in 10 or 20 years, things will be better. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I'm sure that will prompt some questions. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. If you want to put your hands up, if you just want to say who you are and where you're from, we'll lead off with a link.
Elaine Simpson from Circa. I absolutely agree with where you got to, but some of your analysis really, really worried me. And I'd just like to go a bit further into that. And it's not about credentials, because I think my best credentials are personal, far more so than the fact I've spent 35 years in this sector, because I started very young. I think that, first of all, you talked about, in terms of organisation, you referred to early years as less complex than HE. Now, actually, the truth of the matter is that in early years, particularly with the incoming and children's centres, first of all, the public sector is now doing the majority of delivery for 2-, 3- and 4-year-olds, far and away the majority. And actually, the creation of the children's centres, which I still think are fabulous in concept, but it drove the private and voluntary sector out of space because they couldn't afford to compete because it was so heavily subsidised. But actually within that, you're dealing with the whole family situation, with parental issues, with a very, very complex set of needs. Whereas with HE, you're dealing with motivated, want to learn, you know, I mean, I know it's a bit more complex than that. And I just would really challenge that initial analysis that separated those two like that, because for me, HE is the last bastion of public sector relaxation. It really is, and in terms of driving down the price point, preventing cross-subsidy, really challenging what we're paying for there. And it looks like the report, you know, Will Brown's report is actually going to let them get away with it. I just think we've just let the HE sector carry on regardless and give way to the Vice Chancellor's very loud voices.
Yeah, I won't comment on the HE sector, I think, since I'm in it. But the Sure Start scheme that you're kind of referring to, as far as I can discern people working in it, that it quite often misses the people that are most needed to get in it. And the principle I'm working to, which might be wrong, is that the one way you want to get the bottoms sending their children to standardised provision is if everybody does. And having these special niches for, and the package, yes, it tries to address multiple needs, but it also imposes so many conditions that it kind of puts off a lot of the. No?
There are universal service now. There's 3,500, there's 2,800, and there's as many of them as there are secondary schools, and actually it's quite reversed in many ways.
Okay.
And that was one of the criticisms of the incoming coalition government, that it had actually become you know, something that was used more by the middle classes than by those in need. But
it seems that you sort of both of them, you're making the point there's still a lot of people who don't go to Eurostar who you would like to. You're making the point there's a lot of people using Eurostar who it wasn't initially intended to serve.
Well, I think the point I'm making is that actually with the introduction of Eurostar and the universality of Eurostar, it has become across the piece the fact, and it is a fact, that most provision for people, for children 2, 3 and 4 is in the public sector rather than in the private voluntary sector, which is the reverse of where you started from. And I think you were right 4 years ago, but not any longer.
Okay, thank you.
There was a gentleman at the back there.
Hi, David Hanson. I want to ask about early years as well. You said that sort of natural conditions must state provision based on economies of scale, but surely in early years the two dominant drivers of cost are A, the pay of staff, and B, the ratio of staff to children, which would suggest there isn't really economies of scale. You can do that as long as you've got the indivisibilities right, you can do it rather on a small scale.
In my experience, the unit cost of the formatter is pretty low. They work to a fairly low ratio of staff to children. Indeed, that's sometimes a criticism. Whereas the system here seems to be very limited and also rationed. In France, you can't have an absolute right to a place. Here you've got to go and persuade somebody to take your child on.
But that's not the same as there being a sort of natural economic scale.
Well, the natural economic scale comes from the simplicity of organising mass delivery. That if you know you've got to supply everybody everywhere, whereas the danger of the market is that it's pocketing. There are gaps, and there are gaps and differences. So that would be my.
There was a lady in the second back.
Me? Yeah. Me and Doris are personally a team. I do education research would like to challenge the linear assumption in the model. In a weird work, and it looks at the value added of education sectors. It says when you actually control the intake factors, the value added of private is exactly the same as the value added of state, if not lower. So the question is, are they actually buying better education with that money, or is it buying something slightly different, which will remain regardless in terms of the networks, the connections, the peer group, and will that just be kind of bought in a sticky way if you had this change of binomial system? And my second question is, if you did have this kind of more normal distribution, how in practice does that work in the sense that does the parents mostly follow the child in one school, or is it that a parent, if I wanted to pay 8,000 more or that extra 3, do I give it to the school and say you can only spend on my child, and therefore it benefits just that person, or does it go into a pot and then the local school goes up? How in practice would that look?
I think the latter question, how in practice would work, is that you'd get a distribution of schools by charges levels. There'd be some charge 0, some charge a lot, but most would charge somewhere in the middle. So that you'd have a standardised charge per school. The difference between the schools, I think, is the answer. What you then find is this unimodal distribution, because when we look at anything else that people buy, it's unimodal. And it will be much more likely unimodal because everybody's got the £5,000. So you start from a nearly satisfying what the average person wants. Your earlier question about what is it buying is been a long-standing issue in education. Is education buying just screening and signalling effects, or is it actually buying something improving quality? I think and your results that you cited are, in a way, don't challenge. I mean, you said it sort of challenged the idea that quality is linear in education, but actually it sounds to me kind of the other way around. If once you control everything, the value level per pound is the same public and private, which sounds to be what they say, then that sounds very like my assumption of linearity. I don't want to, I mean, it is merely an assumption. It's not something, it's not a hypothesis. It's just a holding operation to abstract from the issues of how should education be organised.
Kristen from the Schools Council. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how you envision more independent schools in blended funding model. Would it entail reinstating system places?
Yeah, so they would, private schools would draw money from the state as well as from councils, basically. It's kind of, I think it's that simple that you can, what I'm suggesting is really independent of the mode of provision, whether it's public or private. So state-run schools would have a blend of funding, private schools would have a blend of funding. You might well start to find both public run, both state-run and private run having the same blend. And then you'd be able to compare like with like to see which mode of organisation is actually doing a better job. At the moment, why there's such confusion after all these years is we're never in a position to compare like with like.
Certainly.
Paul Whitehouse, Chair, Program Friends, you wanted to be warned if you said in your thought out a particular political side. You're offering vouchers. But you haven't said vouchers, but that's actually what you're talking about.
I chose not to use the word vouchers because vouchers takes us into as you imply, into a political territory, and and also into a set of hypotheses about who should provide.
No.
Well, to an extent.
So you're merely saying that everyone should have the right to...
no, entirely.
Entirely. So if we give everyone a voucher, they can use it in the state system...
No, entirely, but what I was meaning is the actual voucher debate has become so politicized that it's got contaminated with that confusion. So I think it's and there are all sorts of ways you could organise this payment. So the idea of a parent turning up with a voucher is kind of absurd. So I just think it's. I've read all the voucher debate, and I think it's kind of it's an unhealthy debate because it is so political science.
I'm sure it's all this bit. So it seems to me that one of the potentially attractive things about this idea, particularly if you had a more kind of social democratic point of view, is that you can, at the moment, poorer pupils do get more money following them around the system. There is poor schools that are receiving more funds. You could be increasing the slope of that taper quite hard. If you're particularly concerned about equity, it wouldn't need to be a flat voucher necessarily. You could be a voucher for quite a lot of money for the very disadvantaged.
That's
tapering to nothing in the middle rather than a flat function with a cliff edge.
No, absolutely, absolutely, you're quite right. I mean, that's what I was implying by saying that the way to deal with the bottom is to just attach more money to those children. You can attach a lot more money. So you're quite right. It frees you up. It's a good way of thinking. It frees you up to have a different structure of tapering from flat with a cliff, which is what we've got.
You've been very patient, sir.
I think you might have answered the question. My concern was the SEN areas. But I hear you well on mainstream. My concern, I don't distribute design, I've done research on elements for special education needs and children. I think we have a major problem in this country where we have 1 or 2 million kids who don't attend schools and private. The question is, how do we make sure they achieve the 5 elements of activity and start doing everything else?
You see,
how do you see that?
Well, let me be frank, the reason I got into this is that I got 3 kids with special educational needs. I got 1 dyslexic and 2 came from this most disastrous background. And so I realized that they needed more spend than the £5,000. And the only way I could get that was to take them to the private sector, which is superb. Very expensive, superb. If you spend enough money, you get something that's fabulous. No, it's very, very expensive. And so that's what set me off thinking, thank goodness I'm in a position to afford meeting the needs of these children. Most people aren't. And so most people would be willing to, if you've got a child with special needs and you're an average income household, you probably would be prepared to reach into your pocket and come up with as much as you could afford. You're not allowed to do that. And the state should then be saying, well, because of these special needs, we'll reach into our pocket too. So both the special needs can be met both by households and by the state.
But special needs has no socioeconomic class.
Well, the targeting does not have to be by socioeconomic class. I mean, we're kind of conditioned to think of everything in socioeconomic class terms. But as you imply, special needs are special needs. As long as you can measure them with some objectivity, which you think you can, then you can attach supplementary funding to those special needs. It doesn't have to be just spot the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid.
Thank you. It was fascinating, by the way, but it was interesting you denigrated ideology in there, kind of characterised it as falling between an egalitarian left and a selfish right, and I think perhaps that left-right analysis doesn't really help ever, but there's been a liberal libertarian sort of argument that has said, as what we mean is a voucher scheme, and particularly actually what you rarely get in voucher schemes that have been tried is what you're suggesting, which is a voucher scheme with the ability to supplement it with your own income. That to me, firstly, it seems that those who have come from an ideological background that is more libertarian have probably supported that. Two things that I think are usually thrown against that argument, and I'll put them is first, there are those who think equality is more important than equality. How do you respond to those who say what you are doing is creating a tiered system? And the second is that by subsidising all, you will have a deadweight cost in that you will also be subsidising those who are already paying. And how will you address that issue?
Okay, the equality matters most argument has taken down. I'm perfectly prepared to agree with that. Anybody who thinks that the British educational system is delivering anything remotely like equality must be blind. We've got, to my mind, the most unequal educational system in the world. I don't. My scheme would produce a much more equal distribution of educational quality. You just can't get worse than bimodal. And although fewer kids are in the top mode, by the time you look at the top of our society, they're half the society. So a bimodal distribution at the top, half and half, is as bad as as unequal a distribution as you can possibly get.
Forgive me, just to press on that point though, some extreme egalitarians say you need to ban private education and basically everyone has an equal income.
Yeah, sure. We're not going to, will we? That's all my answer to that. The radical egalitarians have been wanting to ban private education for 40 years. How many years has Labour been in power? They're still there, that sector. It's not bigger, not smaller. Right? So that is not on the menu. Let's look at what's actually on the menu.
The deadweight cost question?
The deadweight cost question. That, of course, any incentive structure, which is the cliff property, saves you money. So, yes, it's part of the cost of the system that having a more sensible incentive system has costs. That's with any, you look at any sort of tapering of incentive. It doesn't have to be flat. You can, as you imply, you can sort of taper. Anything which has a cliff, in one sense, saves you money. It just does so much damage to incentives that it's kind of nice. We try to avoid this.
It's a nuanced point rather than a big one, but there is another major distortion, minor major distortion, which is people paying for private tuition.
Yes.
So they may make pragmatic choices in their charter of state school at primary level, and then pay either better entry to a selective state school or to a private school at secondary. And it's quite a major cost. And for my own peer group, it's a very common choice.
Absolutely, it's important. Yeah. Last month I addressed 200 headmasters, and this point was made very forcefully. But of course, in a way, it's like the housing market. It's kind of a pretty inefficient diversion of money into it's the strategies of desperation.
What's also interesting though is it distorts the figures for performance, because those primary schools where 30% of parents are paying for private tuition are also measuring their outputs.
Yes.
Which have been a large part of partly private sector created.
Yes, that's a very good point. So it's analogous to the zero-sum game of the housing market. It's not zero-sum. Obviously, you're getting some learning from this stuff, but it's if you had a pool of resources, you wouldn't be handling education like that.
So can I ask how you would link the zero-sum game into housing? Or does that come from the system?
It comes from the system because whilst ever we're in a position that the average household wants to spend more on its children's education than it's allowed to, but less then it can't afford to get onto the second mode, the private sector, but it wants to spend more than the state is spending on its children. But the only options it's got now are the supplementary or the housing market. Once you move that, once you lift that so that it's obviously much more efficient to spend it, to improve your child's education by spending more in the school than by buying a house. And so you just puncture that straight off. You don't need a separate strategy to stop the zero-sum game in the housing market. It would just stop.
One of my favourite things I've reflected recently is you can now search by primary school in London where you want to buy a house in a flat, which is incredible. Live it very back.
I may have been slightly confused about sort of the sort of blended system. Are we talking about, because it sort of raised quite a lot of questions, are we talking about different schools? So one school will be where parents, every child is allocated £5,000 by the government, but parents top up £2,000 or £3,000, and then you have the local school, which then only gets the £5,000 because the parents say can't afford, or as you said before, maybe are unwilling to give them money for whatever reason. Because then surely all it does is exactly the same as selective schools. I mean, I know that our system now isn't perfect. I work in a school where parents would chew off their arm to get their kids into it, and the result is you end up with sort of local sync schools that then don't have the same sort of social mix, the same kind of middle class and working class kids working together and actually bring up everyone. And I just think surely this system would just exacerbate that even further, where then you've just got schools where, if you can't do, then your kids just get the bog standard. And so it just seems like, okay, it might be for the majority of people, but it's really leaving people behind. And the targeted funding then, if we're at capacity with school funding now, and that's at 5,000, then where would we suddenly get this extra money from? If every school's still getting 5,000 per child, where would we suddenly get the extra money for to target on these schools, which are then left not only sort of poor, say, in money compared to other schools, but also poor in terms of social diversity and the things that really actually matter for kids' education, because that does matter.
Yeah, first of all, so 2 points. One is the equity point and one is the funding point. So the equity point, this would not produce all schools identical. But that's a goal that cannot be reached. What we've got now is a very wide gulf between what the average family buy and what rich households buy. Very wide. And that makes a huge difference to the life chances of the average child.
But then surely what you're doing is moving up their life chances, but leaving other ones behind.
No, because what we're doing, we've already got, between the average and the bottom, we've already got a differentiated system, but it's differentiated by the zero-sum game of the housing market, rather than by a positive sum game. What's more, at the moment, we don't have the good instruments for lifting the bottom. Lifting the bottom would cost more money. Come to that in a bit. But the aspect of equity, we're fooling ourselves if we think that the present system produces equity. It produces this bimodal distribution, which is the most unequal distribution you could possibly have. So that's the first point. On the cost point, I mean, this is not for implementation next year, but it's a matter of, as resources permit, what do you want to do? Do you want to spend the same amount more on every child, or do you want to raise the spending for the most needy and the most disadvantaged? And this provides a greater scope for doing the latter, because you put the neediest children in the schools that were actually spending more.
But so, what do you expect?
We will come back to that.
I actually have quite similar to that, because at the moment you don't have the £5,000 flat rate on anything. You have, in effect, something that's very similar to the pupil premium. It's just very complex, so that people don't really recognise that that's what's happening. The schools in the private areas actually do get more money per pupil already. So it's not like it's 5,000, no matter where you come from. It's just that actually having a pupil premium that slopes those 5,000 according to need per pupil would actually enable schools to make a target and say, well, we would like to encourage, very similar to charter schools in the US, we'd like to encourage certain schools from a certain deprived background with certain problems to come, because then they can realise economies of scale in a particular school dealing with one particular problem. So I don't think it's a matter of everybody needs to go to exactly the same school. I think it's a matter of everybody needs to the school that's right for them, and seeing how children are very different. Schools should be very different, and then parents should be able to choose. The problem that is going to be with choice is that you actually need to have a surplus. So you need to actually, it will cost more to create choice, because you need to create more places than there's demand for parents to actually have a meaningful choice.
Yes.
So you will throw some money out, but then that's probably the only option you have if you want to have a semi-market situation.
Yeah. That's what
There was a lady at the front, and come to you, sir.
Hi, have you found any countries that practice this political system?
Yeah, I would say I'm not an expert in education, but there's a fair number of schools in Australia have this blended funding approach, and in Africa, which is where I do most of my work, loads of schools have blended funding. Blended funding is kind of more. Yeah. I'm sorry?
What countries in Africa?
Oh, Kenya, but quite a lot, really. Quite a lot. The biggest, that's how the education system evolved. The state couldn't afford to do everything, so you've got private provision of the state moving in but allowing schools to charge top-up fees. Typically, the state would pay for teachers' salaries, but then you'd have fees doing the supplementary stuff.
I just wondered, it sounded like you were doing some further research on this since your article, and I wonder if you've been looking at any of the OECD countries. I know Australia has something like 25% of its kids because it's a top-up system in private schools. I don't know if there's anything you take away from those more kind of developed economy experiences.
I've not looked to see whether hopefully somebody's looked to see whether the Australian blended funding system actually delivers something that's superior, but I haven't.
Yeah, with two questions right next to each other. We'll start with you, so if you can say who you are away from, and then next.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, I'm actually a little bit of a counselor, but I just want to pick up a point here, which is about the sort of the need to have oversupply, to have surplus, and that creates inefficiencies. And I want to question whether that's actually true, the idea that having a market, which means that producers must create a surplus so there's always enough for people to buy, is inevitably inefficient in other sectors where surely there must be overproduction. We don't consider those sectors to be particularly efficient. In fact, in many ways they're more efficient than the public sector. I also raise the question, surely the inevitable outcome of this is that ultimately provision must be in the private sector, or at least in effect the public sector is competing like another private sector provider, because what you have to have is choice. You have to have the ability to move your child from one school to another because you are dissatisfied with the provision they're having, in which case effectively you have private provision.
Oh, yeah, let's move out of education into health. And again, if we look at France, the French system is a public insurance system, but unlike our health insurance system, you can actually apply your public health insurance either to state-run health facilities or private-run health facilities. And the market equilibrium is that about 2/3 of provision is state and 1/3 is private. So the state is perfectly able to compete in that French health market. But it does have to be, it has to be as good as the private, otherwise nobody will go there. France, with its much sort of deeper socialist tradition than Britain, has come up with this separation of how you fund from how you provide. Whereas here it's trying to pull those two dimensions of the debate apart is very hard work.
Because can I just what about the issue of the idea that a market must be inefficient because it has overcapacity?
There are it's no. There's no indication that produces inefficiency at all. You most likely gain inefficiency by the ability to move. The people are always moving to the better, the more cost-effective. So you have a little bit of slack to allow movement, but then the dynamic gain you get is that you'll always be allocating demand to the more cost-effective suppliers.
It's worth asking whether you even need more service places. There are a lot of current systems. I mean, half empty instead of school now. There's a question right next to you and then over to the left.
Right.
Sorry, no, there's actually to his left.
Yeah.
And then we'll go around to you again, sir. Because anyone who has an axe to fill.
Again. To go back quick to that bimodal structure, the 7% we pay for 15,000 on average, end up with 50% quite later in life. If we did move to a system of share funding, what do we know, I don't know if this is the right term, but what do you know about the price elasticity of that 7%? What is their ability to pull away then, again, from a new system, and we end up with a slightly even more shifted bimodal structure where they're just paying even more? Like, do we know much about the kind of...
We probably do. I don't, but I think much the most likely, there are, in analytic economics, there are two effects here. There's an income effect and a substitution effect. And for the high income groups, the income effect is tiny. You give them an extra 5,000 a year, their income's 150,000. The income effect's absolutely tiny. What is big is the substitution effect. The substitution effect, which is working on what's relative value for money. And at the moment, it's pushing you to higher quality, because at the margin, every extra pound you spend buys an extra pound in quality. But the first £5,000 you spend just gets you to zero. So the value of what you're spending goes up and up the more you spend, and you get rid of that effect. That's the substitution effect. And I think it's overwhelmingly likely that the substitution effect will dominate this income effect, because for the rich the income effect is so small, it's such a small percentage change in their income. And so the rich will move down to lower quality. That's what it means for the substitution effect to dominate the income effect.
I mean, I think part of it comes back to what you were saying, and I think it's important to remember that 93–94% of the UK pupils are actually in the state sector, and only a very small percentage in that other half of the bimodal situation. And I mean, I fully believe in a market-driven system, but mainly because what that will and should drive for us is a better mix of pupils in every school. Because to assume that every £1,000 buys you a better education is actually basically nonsense. It is much, much harder in a school that's serving some of the much, much more challenged areas to end up with 50% or in the case of some of the academies, 80% of the pupils getting 5 A to C's including English and maths. That's 900 times harder than what Eton and Harrow do. And somewhere along the line, we've got to recognise that quality of education isn't necessarily better in one or the other. What happens is that we're better with a mixed grouping and a performance management system that keeps everything moving forward. And I just worry sometimes that we make the assumptions that because one gets better outputs, irrespective of the inputs, that it's doing better in the middle, which isn't actually the case.
But I think that's taking it back to the issue of private versus state provision, which I just want to stress it's kind of, that's not the core of the conversation.
No, and
sorry, just before we come to you, there's someone who hasn't asked any questions yet, and then we'll come on to your price. I said that last time, I know, but sorry.
I'm really from the impacts of this council. Can I just, I don't want to get into the whole independent state writing, I'll just try and correct some of the stats I'm going around to. It's more than 27% of people in the independent sector. People do move between the two sectors through their school careers. Kind of brings me on to a slightly contradictory point of raised. While there is that dynamism to some extent, the picture you paint is a really attractive picture, very, very interesting. Does it require a lot more movement to have those choices of the characters we're able to select them, which sound great sitting there in this room, but in reality, a system where there's that much movement from school to school would be rather disruptive. I'm not sure whether the reality would be quite as big as it sounds.
What percentage of some you need a number? What percentage are in the private system at some point?
We've done research that suggests 14% experience in education at some point during that.
And do they move in and out of schools? Like actually got the impression last time that you chose a school and people tend to then stick in the private system or not, as it were. There's a lot of choosing at the start, but not once their school career has started.
Well, there's obviously lots of movement because schools have different year groups. The movement tends to be into the sector rather than out of the sector.
Does this require a lot of churning and sort of active choice making in this?
No, I don't think so. There's some evidence that it's better to get into a school and stay there for a fairly long time. So parents would take that into account. So I don't there'll probably be more than now, but whether it's small here relative to the sheer geographic movement.
I think we're back to run out of time. Do you run, or we take just a last bunch of questions together? Sorry, do you want to make a question?
The only concern I have is that I agree with what you're saying. My concern is that the kind of children I work with, the disposable income is a major effect. So, how do you try and balance that in the kind of core climate we're going to move into? Right, because we are creating breedings, they will become needs, and they'll end up with joblessness. And how do you square that circle?
Are there any other lots of questions?
I'd say we've had a big increase in education spending without a lot of analysis of how to do it well. And we might have been able to do it a whole lot. We might have been able to get a lot more from that increase in money. Managing the system, which is in budgetary decline, is going to be like, it's not going to last forever. So it'll take a decade for the ideas I'm presenting to filter through. But if they do filter through, then by then, perhaps we're in an age where there's again norm is balancing. So lots of those crises were made where you actually think how best to spend. Just spending
Very good.
Thanks very much.
We are out of time. Paul, thank you so much. It's always